I still hear the millionaire's voice, sharp and cold. "Get out of my sight, you dumb janitor." His sneer cut through me deeper than any harsh words. The silence that followed was deafening, almost as if I didn't exist. Maybe you're working for someone who never says thank you, or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret. Picture me, an aging woman wrapped in a faded floral shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal hands hardened by years of scrubbing floors in a towering Manhattan skyscraper. The scent of disinfectant clings to my skin. The echo of footsteps muffled by velvet carpet still rings in my ears. Every morning, I lace up my worn sneakers in the cramped janitor's closet. It's my world before dawn, the world no one truly sees. These 37 floors of glass and steel have been my universe for 15 years. 15 long years of walking the same halls, cleaning the same marble surfaces, and pretending not to hear the cruel whispers that float through these perfumed corridors. I know every crack in the foundation, every loose tile in the bathroom, every squeaky hinge on every door. But do they know me? Do they see the woman behind the mop bucket? The Beaumont family owns this building. Richard Beaumont III, heir to a vast fortune built on stock market investments and real estate holdings that stretch from Manhattan to the Hamptons. His wealth seems endless, with assets tied up in everything from cryptocurrency to gold. I've overheard enough conversations to know that his net worth reaches into the millions, maybe more. But money, I've learned, doesn't buy kindness or compassion. It doesn't buy the ability to see another human being's worth. On this particular day, the luxury penthouse felt colder than usual. I was cleaning windows on the 42nd floor when Richard appeared behind me, his Armani suit crisp and his cologne expensive. His son Tommy, a beautiful 12-year-old boy born deaf, sat at the grand piano in the corner, his fingers dancing silently across the keys. The boy had learned to feel the vibrations, to create music through touch rather than sound. "Margaret," Richard's voice cut through the morning stillness like ice. "My business associates are coming today. Make sure everything is spotless. And if you see Tommy trying to communicate with you, just ignore him. Talk to my deaf son if you think you're smart enough." He laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Though I doubt someone like you could understand anything about his condition." His words slammed into me, a blade disguised in sarcasm. Alone, I bit my tongue to keep my pride from shattering. Tommy looked up at me then, his bright eyes full of intelligence and sadness. He had been trying to teach me sign language during our quiet moments together, when his father wasn't around to mock us both. This child, dismissed by his own father, had shown me more kindness in stolen moments than the entire family had in 15 years. I had hoped for a quiet day, something different, but reality, as always, pulled me back into the shadows. The penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, felt like a gilded cage. Persian rugs worth more than my annual salary covered gleaming hardwood floors. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across walls adorned with original Picassos and Monets. Every surface screamed wealth and privilege, while I moved through it all like a ghost. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent my days surrounded by millions of dollars in art and furniture. Yet I rode the subway home each night to a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, where the rent consumed half my paycheck. I knew more about maintaining their treasures than they did about maintaining basic human decency. For years, I swallowed that bitterness. Each morning, I rose at 4 a.m., well before my daughter Sarah's school bus arrived. I would stand in her doorway, watching her sleep in the pale blue light of dawn, her face peaceful and trusting. I'd kiss her sleeping forehead and slip away into the darkness, knowing I wouldn't return until long after she'd gone to bed. I missed every recital, every birthday, every little triumph etched into my child's life, replaced by endless nights of scrubbing floors in a city that never sleeps. "You're lucky," they'd say at the building staff meetings. "Lucky to have steady work, a good job, benefits." The other workers would nod in agreement, but their eyes told a different story. We were all lucky, they said. Lucky to serve the wealthy, lucky to breathe the same air, lucky to exist in the margins of their magnificent lives. But those words echoed hollow in my solitude. The weight of that luck pressed down on me every day. I was lucky to work 16-hour shifts when someone called in sick, lucky to clean up after their dinner parties that lasted until 3 in the morning, lucky to pick up their dry cleaning, walk their dogs, and water their plants, lucky to be yelled at when something went wrong, even when it wasn't my fault. Raising other people's children, particularly Tommy, Richard's son, became part of my unofficial duties. The boy gravitated toward me, perhaps sensing that I saw him as more than just his disability. While his father treated him like an embarrassment to hide from business partners, I learned his name sign and practiced basic conversation with him during my lunch breaks. He taught me that thank you in sign language looked like blowing a kiss to the world. How beautiful was that? Yet to the family, I remained invisible. Always just the janitor. When Richard's wife Charlotte threw elaborate fundraising galas for deaf children's charities, she never mentioned that their own son was deaf. The irony was cruel and sharp. They raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for children like Tommy, while treating their own son like a shameful secret. "Make sure the lobby sparkles," Charlotte would bark down the hallway, her Louboutin heels clicking against marble like gunshots. "Not like last week. The Vanderbilts are coming for dinner, and I won't have them thinking we employ incompetent help." The sting of blame for something I didn't do never faded. Someone else had handled the lobby the week before, but facts didn't matter when they needed a scapegoat. Was I loved, or just useful? The question haunted me during those long nights when I'd scrubbed their bathtubs until my knees ached and my hands cracked from harsh chemicals. Every day carried 1,000 tiny cuts. The delayed paycheck when their accountant was tied up with stock transactions, the lack of recognition when I worked through the flu, the whispered accusations when expensive items went missing, as if I would risk my livelihood to steal from people who already had everything. Once, Richard's sister Victoria accused me of being inappropriately familiar with her brother. I'd simply asked if Tommy could spend Christmas with his family in the main living area, instead of hidden away in his room like a guilty secret. "You need to remember your place," she told me, her emerald earrings catching the light like cold fire. "We're kind enough to employ you, but that doesn't give you the right to interfere in family matters." The humiliation burned through me. Here I was, a woman who had dedicated years to caring for their home and their child, being treated like a potential threat for showing basic human compassion. I retreated to the supply closet and wept silently into a stack of towels that smelled like bleach and broken dreams. But it was a Tuesday in November when everything began to crack. I was polishing the silverware in their formal dining room, each piece worth more than my monthly salary, when I overheard Richard on a business call. He was discussing diversifying his portfolio, moving money between stocks and cryptocurrency investments, particularly Bitcoin, which had been performing well. Then I heard my name. "The staff costs are getting ridiculous," he said into his gold-plated phone. "Especially that old janitor woman, Margaret something. We're paying her too much for what amounts to basic housekeeping. I'm thinking of cutting her hours, maybe her health benefits too. She's getting older anyway, probably won't be around much longer." My hands froze on the silver soup tureen. After 15 years of loyalty, of quiet service, of loving their son when they couldn't, this was how they saw me. A line item to be reduced, an expense to be minimized. The ornate piece slipped from my trembling fingers and crashed onto the Persian rug below. The sound seemed to echo through the entire penthouse, a percussion of pain and realization. Richard appeared in the doorway instantly, his face twisted with annoyance. "Now look what you've done. That tureen belonged to my grandmother. It's probably worth more than you make in a year." He didn't ask if I was hurt, didn't notice the tears streaming down my face. He only saw the cost, the inconvenience, the disruption to his perfect world. I bent to collect the pieces, my reflection fracturing into a dozen silver fragments. Each shard showed me something different: my weathered hands, my graying hair, my tired eyes. The pieces mirrored my fracture inside, all the ways this job had broken me down over the years until I barely recognized myself anymore. That night, after everyone had gone to their respective rooms, I sat in the dim light of the penthouse living room, holding a faded photograph I kept folded in my pocket. It was from my daughter's 8th birthday, 5 years ago. I had missed the party because Charlotte needed me to supervise a dinner for potential investors. In the photo, Sarah stood alone beside her cake, her smile forced and fragile. The other parents had made polite excuses for my absence, but I could see the hurt in my little girl's eyes. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone and started typing a resignation letter. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water through a broken dam. I wrote about the respect I deserved, the dignity they had stripped away piece by piece, the humanity they had never bothered to see. But as I reached the end, my courage failed me. I deleted every word and put the phone away. Fear, habit, and financial need kept me tethered, for now. Sarah needed new school clothes. The rent was due next week. My mother in New Jersey required medication that insurance wouldn't cover. I was trapped by the very people who treated me like furniture, valuable enough to keep but never precious enough to cherish. But something had shifted inside me that night, like a tectonic plate moving deep underground. The whisper that had been growing louder over the months became impossible to ignore. What would happen if I just walked away? For the first time in 15 years, I began to seriously consider it. The next morning brought fresh humiliation. Charlotte's personal trainer, a young man with sculpted muscles and an attitude to match, was using the building's private gym. I was cleaning the equipment when he approached me, towel slung over his shoulder like a victor's banner. "Hey, cleaning lady," he said, not bothering to learn my name after months of seeing me work. "Make sure you sanitize that bench really well. I don't want to catch whatever poor people diseases you might have." He laughed at his own cruelty, the sound bouncing off the mirrored walls like a slap. I wanted to tell him that I had a college degree in education, that I had once taught 3rd grade before budget cuts eliminated my position. I wanted to explain that I spoke 3 languages and had raised a brilliant daughter who made honor roll every semester. Instead, I nodded silently and sprayed the bench again. My reflection multiplied endlessly in the mirrors around me, a woman disappearing into her own invisibility. It was around this time that I began to hesitate before sending my monthly financial support home. For 12 years, I had faithfully transferred money to help with my mother's care and my brother's family expenses. But that week, I stared at the banking app on my phone for 20 minutes before closing it without making the transfer. The phone call started immediately. "Margaret, where's the money?" my brother demanded, his voice sharp with accusation rather than concern. "Mom needs her medicine. You can't just stop helping family." But how could I explain that I was questioning everything, not just my family obligations, but my entire existence as someone whose value was measured only by what I could provide to others? The house felt different during those days of quiet rebellion. Charlotte seemed more critical than usual, volleying backhanded compliments like tennis balls aimed at my self-esteem. "Margaret, I do appreciate how you keep trying, even at your age," she said while examining the crystal glasses I had just polished. "Though of course you're not quite as thorough as you used to be. It's natural, I suppose. We all slow down eventually." Her silk Hermes scarf probably cost more than I made in 3 months, but she spoke to me as if I should be grateful for her condescension. The irony was suffocating. Here was a woman who had never worked a day in her life, whose greatest accomplishment was marrying into wealth, critiquing the work ethic of someone who had been supporting herself since she was 16. Tommy, sweet Tommy, seemed to sense the tension in the house. He had been teaching me more sign language during our stolen moments together, and that week he asked me if I was sad. His small hands moved gracefully through the air, forming words his father had never bothered to learn. When I nodded, he signed, "I love you," and hugged me with the fierce intensity that only children possess. It was that hug that nearly broke my resolve. This child loved me when his own family treated him like an inconvenience. He sought me out for comfort when nightmares woke him, came to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. Yet I was just the hired help, forbidden from forming real connections, expected to care without being cared for in return. The family's outrage over my small acts of independence was swift and merciless. Richard cornered me in the utility room one morning, his face flushed with anger. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, Margaret, but this attitude needs to stop. You work for us, not the other way around. If you can't maintain proper respect, there are plenty of other people who would be grateful for this job." His words hit their intended target. The threat of unemployment loomed over every service worker in Manhattan like a constant storm cloud. We were replaceable, dispensable, utterly dependent on the whims of those we served. The power imbalance was so complete that even basic dignity felt like an extravagance we couldn't afford. Charlotte was subtler, but no less cruel. She began scheduling me for tasks during my supposed days off, always with the sweetest smile and the most reasonable explanations. "I know it's your weekend, Margaret, but we have the Astors coming for brunch, and you know how particular they are about presentation. Surely you understand how important this is for Richard's business relationships." How could I say no? Their investments in stock portfolios depended on maintaining social connections. Their Bitcoin holdings and real estate deals required constant networking. My rest day seemed insignificant compared to their millions, at least according to their reasoning. So I worked and smiled and pretended that my exhaustion didn't matter. But amidst all this coldness, an unexpected warmth appeared. Sonia Ramirez, the building's rooftop gardener, offered friendship without agenda. She was a short woman with calloused hands and eyes that had seen struggle, who tended the building's sky-high oasis with the same care I cleaned their floors. Unlike everyone else, she saw me as a person rather than a function. "You look tired, Hermana," she said one afternoon, as I emerged onto the roof for a rare breath of fresh air. She handed me a cup of tea without being asked, steam rising between us like incense. "When's the last time you did something just for yourself?" I couldn't remember. Literally could not recall a single activity I had done purely for my own enjoyment in months, maybe years. Everything was work, or family obligation, or survival. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping in the autumn air 42 stories above the city. Sonia showed me her garden that day, tomatoes and herbs growing in defiance of Manhattan's concrete jungle, flowers blooming in colors that had no names. "Plants need rest too," she explained, deadheading roses with gentle efficiency. "Otherwise, they stop blooming. Even the strongest ones need time to renew themselves." I took my first real step that week, on a crisp October morning. When Charlotte called to demand I work on my scheduled day off, I found my voice. It came out smaller than I wanted, shaky with fear, but it came nonetheless. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Beaumont. Today is my day off, and I have plans." The silence on the phone stretched so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice-cold with disbelief. "Excuse me? Did you just refuse to work? After everything this family has done for you?" "I'll be in tomorrow as scheduled," I replied, my hands trembling as I ended the call. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I stayed seated. Instead of rushing to apologize, to fix whatever discomfort my boundary had caused, I remained still. I spent that day in Central Park, just a few blocks from the building where I worked, but worlds away from its suffocating atmosphere. I bought myself a sandwich from a food cart, turkey and Swiss on rye, and ate it slowly on a bench facing the pond. Children played nearby, their laughter floating across the water like music. Couples walked hand in hand. Dog owners chatted while their pets socialized. Life, I realized, went on beautifully outside the walls of my servitude. For the first time in months, I watched a sunset instead of working through it. The sky painted itself in shades of pink and gold, reflecting off the glass towers that defined Manhattan's skyline. Somewhere up there, the Beaumonts were probably angry about my absence, plotting consequences for my defiance. But in that moment, watching beauty unfold without cost or condition, I didn't care. That night, I slept deeply, free of the usual nightmares about missed deadlines and disappointed employers. I dreamed instead of gardens and sunshine, of my daughter's laughter and my own forgotten dreams. When I woke the next morning, something fundamental had shifted. I felt rested for the first time in years. The backlash came swiftly. Charlotte greeted me with icy silence, Richard made cutting remarks about unreliable help, and Victoria went out of her way to create extra messes for me to clean. They were punishing me for daring to value myself, for believing that my time had worth beyond their convenience. But I had tasted freedom, and it was intoxicating. That week, I opened a savings account at a small bank in Queens, something I'd been too frightened to do before. The teller, a kind woman about my age, smiled as she processed my paperwork. "It's never too late to start planning for yourself," she said, and her words felt like a benediction. I began making small changes, buying myself coffee from the good cafe instead of drinking the bitter break-room sludge, taking longer lunch breaks, speaking up when blamed for things I hadn't done. Each tiny act of self-advocacy felt revolutionary after years of silent acceptance. The family noticed immediately. Their comfort depended on my complete submission, my willingness to absorb their bad moods and neglect without complaint. When I began to exhibit even the slightest backbone, it threatened their entire worldview. Richard confronted me directly one morning, backing me into a corner near the service elevator. "I don't know what's gotten into you, Margaret, but this changes now. You've been acting like you're too good for this job, like you deserve special treatment. Let me remind you that you're easily replaceable. There are hundreds of people who would kill for the opportunities we've given you." His breath smelled like expensive whiskey and entitlement. I looked up at this man who had never changed a bedsheet or scrubbed a toilet in his life, who inherited more money than most people could spend in several lifetimes, and felt something snap inside me. "You're right," I said quietly. "I've been acting differently. I've been acting like a human being deserves basic respect. If that makes me unsuitable for this position, then perhaps we need to have a different conversation." His face went purple with rage, but before he could respond, Tommy appeared around the corner. The boy looked between us with worried eyes, sensing the tension even though he couldn't hear our words. Richard immediately straightened his tie and forced a smile, unwilling to let his son see him being cruel to someone the boy obviously cared about. That afternoon brought the confrontation I had been dreading and expecting. The family summoned me to the penthouse's grand dining room for what Charlotte termed a family discussion. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 15 years of being treated like furniture, they suddenly wanted to include me in family matters. They sat arranged around their mahogany table like judges at a tribunal. Richard at the head, Charlotte to his right, Victoria across from her, and even Richard's elderly mother, a woman who rarely left her Park Avenue apartment, had been wheeled in for the occasion. Tommy sat at the far end, confusion clear on his sweet face. Charlotte began with crocodile tears and inflated promises. "Margaret, we've always thought of you as family," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than my weekly salary. "We're hurt and confused by your recent behavior. Haven't we always treated you well? Given you steady work, health benefits, even bonuses during the holidays?" The audacity was breathtaking. They spoke of treating me like family while paying me poverty wages and expecting me to be available 24 hours a day. Their idea of generosity was allowing me to exist in their orbit, as if my labor was a gift I gave rather than a service I provided. Richard leaned forward, his expression crafted to appear caring, but failing to hide the calculation behind it. "We've invested a lot in you over the years, Margaret. Training, trust, making you part of our household. It would be a shame to lose that relationship over some temporary misunderstanding." His grandmother spoke from her wheelchair, her voice papery with age but sharp with authority. "In my day, good help was appreciated and stayed where they belonged. This modern tendency to forget one's place is most unseemly." Her diamonds caught the chandelier light as she gestured dismissively. "Perhaps we've been too lenient." I listened to them rewrite history, painting themselves as benevolent employers and me as an ungrateful servant who had forgotten her station. They spoke about me as if I weren't sitting right there, as if my thoughts and feelings were irrelevant to their deliberation. When they finished their scripted interventions, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the keyring they had given me years ago. 15 keys for 15 years of service, each one representing a different aspect of their lives I'd been trusted to maintain. I set them gently on the polished table. "I appreciate the opportunity you've given me," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. "But I won't be needing these anymore." Standing up felt like emerging from underwater, like breathing for the first time in years. The silence that followed was profound. They had expected tears, apologies, desperate pleas for forgiveness. Instead, they got dignity they couldn't understand and strength they hadn't prepared for. But that's when the real shock came, the twist that would change everything. As I gathered my things from the janitor's closet, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind cleaning supplies, I found a folder of financial documents that Richard had obviously discarded and forgotten about. Tax papers, investment records, portfolio statements, all bearing my name and social security number. Years ago, their accountant had mistakenly listed me as a dependent for tax purposes, then apparently forgot to correct the error. But the implications were staggering. According to these documents, I was legally listed as having financial interest in several of their investments, including stock holdings and cryptocurrency wallets worth millions. The mistake had grown over time, compounded by automatic reinvestment policies and the complexity of their diversified portfolio. Legally speaking, I had claimed to assets they probably assumed were safely in their control. My hands shook as I photographed each page with my phone, documenting evidence of their carelessness with both money and people. I called my daughter that night and told her everything. Sarah, now 13 and wiser than her years, listened quietly as I explained the financial documents and what they might mean. "Mom," she said finally, "maybe this is the universe giving you back something they took from you." The next morning, I visited a legal aid office in downtown Manhattan, carrying copies of everything I had found. The lawyer, a sharp woman in her 40s, reviewed the documents with growing amazement. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, looking up at me with something close to awe, "do you understand what this means? According to these filings, you have legal claim to approximately 15% of their liquid assets. That's potentially millions of dollars." The Beaumonts discovered the missing documents within hours. Richard called me in a panic, his usual arrogance replaced by barely controlled terror. "Margaret, I need you to come in immediately. There's been a misunderstanding with some paperwork, and we need to sort it out." But I wasn't the frightened woman who had cleaned their floors for 15 years anymore. "I'm sorry, Mr. Beaumont, but I don't work for you anymore. If you need to discuss legal matters, you can have your attorney contact mine." The silence on the phone stretched until he finally hung up without another word. Within an hour, his lawyer called, then Charlotte's lawyer, then the family's primary legal counsel. They all wanted to meet, to clarify the situation, to offer settlements and compromises. I didn't gloat, but I held firm. For the first time in our relationship, I had something they needed more than they had something I needed. The power balance hadn't just shifted, it had completely reversed. Their attempts at intimidation began almost immediately. Victoria called, screaming about how I was trying to steal from people who had given me everything. Richard left voicemails threatening to ruin my reputation, to make sure I never worked in Manhattan again. Charlotte hired a private investigator to look into my background, searching for anything they could use against me. But their lawyers quickly explained the reality of the situation. The documents were legitimate, filed with the IRS and signed by Richard himself. Challenging them would require admitting to tax fraud or gross negligence in their financial management. Either path would cost them far more than simply negotiating with me. The settlement discussions took weeks. They offered increasingly generous packages, lump sums, annuity payments, benefits extensions. Richard even suggested I could return to work with a substantial raise and better treatment. But what they couldn't understand was that this wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and recognition of my humanity. Their final cruelty came in the form of a letter from Tommy, clearly dictated by his father. The typed words were brutal. "Dear Margaret, my family says you're trying to steal from us. I thought you were my friend, but friends don't hurt each other. Please give back what isn't yours and leave us alone." Reading those words broke my heart, but it also hardened my resolve. They were willing to use their own child as a weapon to poison his innocent affection for me in service of their greed. The 12-year-old boy who had taught me to sign "thank you" was now being taught to see me as a thief and betrayer. I kept that letter folded in my safe, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what I had escaped. It represented everything toxic about that family, their casual cruelty, their willingness to sacrifice anyone for their convenience, their complete inability to take responsibility for their own mistakes. The settlement was finalized on a snowy December morning. I walked out of the law office with a check that represented more money than I had ever imagined having. Not millions, but enough to change my life completely, enough to send my daughter to any college she chose, enough to care for my mother without sacrifice, enough to finally, truly be free. I found a small apartment in Astoria, Queens, with a windowsill perfect for herbs and flowers. For the first time in 15 years, I had space that was mine alone, decorated according to my tastes rather than maintained for someone else's comfort. I planted basil and rosemary, watched them grow in the morning sunlight streaming through windows I owned the right to open. The community center down the street offered cooking classes, and I enrolled immediately. Learning to bake bread felt like a meditation, kneading dough as if I were working years of tension from my hands. The instructor, a grandmother from Sicily, praised my focaccia and asked if I had ever considered opening a small cafe. The idea planted itself in my mind like one of Sonia's rooftop seeds, but the most profound change was in how I carried myself through the world. I no longer flinched when voices rose around me, no longer apologized reflexively for taking up space. I had survived the worst they could do to me and emerged stronger. The woman in the mirror wasn't broken anymore. She was rebuilt, reinforced by trials that had tested but not destroyed her. One afternoon, I visited Sarah's school for a parent-teacher conference, something I had never been able to do while working for the Beaumonts. Her teacher, Mrs. Chen, smiled warmly as she showed me Sarah's artwork and writing samples. "She's gifted," she said simply, "but I think you already knew that. She talks about you constantly, about how proud she is of your courage." My daughter had been watching my transformation, learning lessons about self-worth and dignity that no textbook could teach. She saw me stand up for myself and learned that she could do the same. She witnessed me claim my value and understood that she, too, was worth fighting for. Months passed in a rhythm of healing and renewal. I took walks without destination, read books for pleasure instead of stealing moments between cleaning tasks, called old friends I had lost touch with while drowning in someone else's demands. The luxury of time, my own time, felt more precious than all the Beaumont family's wealth combined. Sometimes I passed their building during my wanderings through Manhattan. The doorman, my replacement, nodded politely as wealthy residents swept past him like he was furniture. I felt no bitterness toward him, only sadness for the familiar invisibility in his eyes. I wanted to tell him about savings accounts and legal documents, about the power that knowledge could bring, but I knew he would only hear the warnings when he was ready. The building itself looked smaller somehow, less imposing. I could see Tommy through the penthouse windows sometimes, still sitting alone at that grand piano, still creating music his family couldn't hear. I hoped that someday he would understand that I hadn't abandoned him, but had finally learned to value myself the way he had always valued me. Sonia found me one day in the rooftop garden of my new building, a much smaller space but mine to tend. "You look different," she said, helping me plant tomatoes in recycled containers. "Lighter, like you're finally growing in your own soil instead of someone else's shadows." Her words captured something I had been trying to articulate for months. Freedom wasn't just about money or independence. It was about the right to grow toward the sun instead of hiding in corners, apologizing for taking up space while others bloomed. I started volunteering at a literacy center in Queens, teaching adults to read English. Many of my students were immigrants like my parents had been, people who worked in visible jobs and dreamed of better lives for their children. I saw my younger self in their determined faces, their willingness to endure hardship for the promise of something more. "Mrs. Rodriguez helps us find our voices," one student wrote in a thank you card. "She shows us that we matter, that our stories are important." Reading those words, I realized that my years with the Beaumonts hadn't been wasted if they had taught me to recognize worth in places others couldn't see it. The community center where I baked bread offered me a part-time job teaching cooking classes to seniors. Standing in front of a group of older adults, sharing recipes and techniques, felt like coming home to myself. These were people who understood the value of simple pleasures, who appreciated the care that went into preparing food with love rather than obligation. "Cooking is about nourishment," I told my students as we rolled out pasta dough together. "Not just feeding the body, but feeding the soul. When we cook for ourselves with the same care we give to others, that's when we truly begin to heal." One evening, as I prepared dinner in my small kitchen, nothing fancy, just chicken and vegetables from my windowsill garden, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, Tommy's voice came through, older and stronger than I remembered. "Margaret," he said, his words slightly unclear but determined. "I learned to talk. I've been practicing for months. I wanted to call you because I know my father made me write that letter. I never wanted to say those things. I miss you. I miss our sign language lessons. I miss having someone who saw me as more than my deafness." Tears streamed down my face as I listened to this brave young man claiming his voice, literally and figuratively. "Tommy," I managed to say, "I'm so proud of you. You've grown so much." "I'm going away to school next year," he continued. "A special program for deaf students where I can learn and grow without people treating me like I'm broken. I wanted you to know that you were the first person who ever made me feel normal. Thank you for that." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, watching the sun set over Queens. The boy I had loved like a son was finding his own path to freedom, learning to value himself despite his family's limitations. In some way, perhaps my journey had shown him that it was possible to survive being underestimated and emerge stronger. The final chapter of my transformation came unexpectedly. Sarah, now in her senior year of high school, was accepted to Columbia University with a full academic scholarship. As we celebrated over ice cream in our small kitchen, she looked at me seriously. "Mom, I want to study social work," she said. "I want to help people who feel invisible, the way you did for so long. I want to make sure that workers have advocates, that their voices get heard." She paused, then smiled. "I learned that from watching you find your courage." In that moment, I understood that my years of sacrifice hadn't been in vain if they had taught my daughter to fight for justice. The humiliation and pain I had endured became meaningful when they inspired someone else to prevent others from suffering the same fate. I thought about the woman I had been 3 years ago, afraid, invisible, convinced that her only value lay in serving others, that Margaret had believed that asking for basic respect was selfish, that setting boundaries was ungrateful. She had measured her worth by how much she could endure rather than by what she deserved. But pain had been my teacher. and invisibility had been my classroom. I learned that dignity isn't something others can give or take away. It's something we claim for ourselves. I discovered that speaking up isn't selfish. It's necessary. I found out that being useful and being valued are two entirely different things. The Beaumont family faded from my daily thoughts, though I still occasionally wondered how they were managing without someone to blame for their problems. I hoped they had learned to see their current employees as human beings, though I suspected old habits died hard among the privileged. What mattered was that I had learned to see myself clearly, perhaps for the first time in my adult life. If you've ever felt invisible, burdened, or unrecognized, remember this: you are not what you do for others. You are not measured by your usefulness or your silence. Your worth doesn't depend on someone else's ability to see it. Sometimes, the strongest battles are fought in quiet moments, and the most profound victories happen when you finally decide that you matter. The woman in the mirror now smiles back at me, not the forced smile of someone trying to please, but the genuine expression of someone who has found peace with herself. She has weathered storms that would have broken a weaker spirit, and she carries scars that tell stories of survival and growth. In the end, freedom isn't about revenge or proving others wrong. It's about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you stood up for yourself when it mattered most. It's about the peace that comes from living authentically, without apology or explanation. It's about understanding that sometimes the most radical act is simply believing that you deserve better. But my story didn't end with that settlement check or Tommy's phone call. Life has a way of surprising us just when we think we've figured everything out. 3 months after Sarah started her freshman year at Columbia, I received an envelope in my mailbox that would change everything once again. The return address was from a law firm I didn't recognize in Midtown Manhattan. Inside was a letter that made me sit down heavily on my small kitchen chair, my hands shaking as I read the formal language that would reshape my understanding of the past 15 years. Dear Ms. Rodriguez, it began, we represent the estate of Evelyn Beaumont, the late matriarch of the Beaumont family. According to documents found among her personal effects, you have been named as a beneficiary in her will. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss this matter. Evelyn Beaumont, Richard's grandmother, the woman who had sat in her wheelchair during that humiliating family conference, dismissing me with her talk about knowing one's place. She had died quietly in her Park Avenue apartment 6 months after our settlement, and apparently she had been watching everything more carefully than any of us realized. The meeting at the law firm was surreal. Mr. Patterson, the executor of Evelyn's will, was a gentleman in his 70s with kind eyes and a voice that carried decades of legal experience. He explained that Evelyn had been compiling evidence of her family's treatment of their domestic staff for the last 3 years of her life. Mrs. Beaumont was quite troubled by what she witnessed, he said, adjusting his glasses as he read from a thick file. She made detailed notes about conversations she overheard, inappropriate behavior she observed, and what she termed the systematic dehumanization of household staff. She was particularly concerned about how they treated you, Ms. Rodriguez. It turned out that the cruel old woman I had feared was actually documenting every slight, every insult, every moment of casual cruelty she witnessed. Her sharp comments during my confrontation with the family hadn't been aimed at me. They had been performative, designed to maintain her cover while she gathered evidence. She left specific instructions that this letter was to be given to you personally, Mr. Patterson said, handing me an envelope sealed with Evelyn's own wax stamp. My name was written across the front in her spidery handwriting, and underneath it, in quotes, "The woman who loved my great-grandson when we could not." I waited until I was home to read her letter, sitting in the same chair where I had opened the first legal correspondence. Evelyn's words, written in the final months of her life, revealed a woman wrestling with guilt, regret, and a desperate desire to make amends. "Dear Margaret," she had written, "I am dying, and with death comes clarity that eluded me in life. I have spent these final years watching my family destroy everything of value in pursuit of wealth that brings them no joy. I have watched them treat you like furniture while you raised their son with more love than they ever showed him. You must understand, I was raised in a different time, when people of different classes rarely mixed as equals. But watching you with Tommy, seeing your patience and kindness despite my family's cruelty, opened my eyes to the woman you are. You have dignity they could never understand and strength they could never possess. The money I leave you comes not from guilt, but from recognition. You earned more than wages in my family's home. You earned respect we never gave you. This inheritance is not charity. It is payment for services that went far beyond cleaning floors. You mothered a child who needed love. You maintained grace under pressure that would have broken lesser people. You showed my great-grandson what kindness looks like. I leave you my personal stocks and bonds portfolio worth approximately $2.3 million. More importantly, I leave you my written testimony about my family's behavior should you ever choose to use it. Tommy will come to you one day when he is old enough to escape their control. Love him as you always have. He will need you. Live freely, Margaret. Live with the dignity you always possessed, but were never allowed to show. Evelyn Beaumont. Attached to her letter were statements showing stock holdings in blue-chip companies, government bonds, and certificates of deposit that had been accumulating interest for decades. The old woman had quietly maintained her own investment portfolio, separate from the family's flashy cryptocurrency and real estate ventures. It was old money, patient money, the kind of wealth that grew slowly but surely over time. The revelation completely reframed my understanding of those final months with the family. Every cruel comment from Richard, every condescending remark from Charlotte, every dismissive gesture from Victoria had been witnessed and documented by a woman who understood the value of what they were losing when they lost me. Mr. Patterson explained that Evelyn had also left detailed instructions for the inheritance. The money was to be placed in a trust that would provide me with a monthly income while preserving the principal for Sarah's education and future needs. There were funds designated for my mother's care, money set aside for Sarah's college expenses that her scholarship didn't cover, and enough left over for me to consider any dreams I might have set aside. She was very specific about one thing, Mr. Patterson said with a small smile. She wanted you to know that this money comes with no conditions, no expectations, and no strings attached. Her exact words were, "Let her live as she chooses." Finally, walking out of that law office, I felt like I was floating above the Manhattan sidewalks. The woman I had feared had been my secret ally. The family that had dismissed me had been under surveillance by their own matriarch. The cruelty I had endured had been witnessed and would be remembered even after I was gone. That evening, I called Sarah at Columbia and told her about the inheritance. She was quiet for so long that I thought our connection had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Mom, do you realize what this means? You're completely free. You could do anything, go anywhere, become anyone you want to be." She paused, and I could hear her struggling not to cry. Grandma Evelyn saw you, really saw you, when they couldn't. The next few months brought changes I had never imagined possible. With financial security assured, I began to dream beyond mere survival for the first time in adult life. The small cafe idea that had taken root in cooking classes began to grow into something real and tangible. I found a tiny storefront in Astoria, just 3 blocks from my apartment. The rent was reasonable, the foot traffic was steady, and the morning sun streamed through the front windows like a blessing. I named it Margaret's Kitchen, simple, honest, and mine. The neighbors embraced the cafe immediately. I served simple foods prepared with care, fresh bread baked daily, soups that simmered with love, sandwiches made with ingredients I chose myself. The menu was small, but everything was made from scratch, with the same attention to detail I had once applied to the Beaumont's silver and crystal. My first regular customer was Mrs. Chen, a retired librarian who lived alone above the flower shop next door. She came in every morning for coffee and a piece of whatever bread I had baked, always bringing a book to read while she ate. After a few weeks, she began staying to help during the lunch rush, washing dishes and chatting with customers who came to feel like family. "You create kindness here," she told me one afternoon as we cleaned up after a busy day. "People leave happier than when they arrived. That's a gift, Margaret. Not everyone can do that." The cafe became a gathering place for people like me, immigrants and working-class families who appreciated good food at honest prices. I hosted sign language classes in the evenings, thinking of Tommy and hoping that somewhere he was still learning to communicate with the world. A local book club met on Sunday mornings, and I always made sure their coffee stayed hot while they discussed their latest selection. 6 months after opening, Tommy found me exactly as Evelyn had predicted. He was taller now, almost 14, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a young man who had learned his worth. He came into the cafe on a Tuesday afternoon, during the quiet hour between lunch and dinner, and signed "hello" with hands that had grown steady and sure. "I ran away," he said, his spoken words much clearer than they had been on the phone. "Not permanently. I told my parents I needed to see you, and they finally agreed. They think I'm seeing a therapist on the Upper East Side." He smiled, and it was the same sweet expression I remembered from his childhood. "I take the subway here instead." We sat at my favorite table by the window, and he told me about the school Evelyn had secretly arranged for him, a place where his deafness was not a disability, but simply a different way of experiencing the world. He was learning multiple forms of sign language, studying music through vibration and visual representation, and for the first time in his life, he felt normal. "She left me a letter too," he said, pulling out an envelope similar to the one I'd received. "Grandmother Evelyn explained everything she watched, everything she documented. She told me about the money she gave you and said it was payment for all the love you gave me when my parents couldn't." Tommy spent 2 hours with me that afternoon, catching up on lost time and sharing stories about his new life. He told me about friends who understood him, teachers who saw his potential rather than his limitations, and a future he was excited to build. Before he left, he taught me the sign for proud, and I taught him the recipe for the focaccia bread he had always loved. "I'll come back every month," he promised as he prepared to leave. "If that's okay with you. These visits, they're the best part of growing up away from home." After he left, I sat in my empty cafe and wept, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude. The boy I had loved through his childhood darkness was growing into a young man who chose light. My years of quiet care had taken root in ways I never could have imagined. The following spring brought another surprise. Sarah called me from Colombia with excitement bubbling in her voice. She had been selected for a summer internship with a legal aid organization that specialized in workers' rights, and her supervising attorney wanted to meet with me. "Mom," she said, barely able to contain her enthusiasm, "they want to document your story about domestic worker abuse. Apparently, the testimony Evelyn left combined with your experience could help other people in similar situations. You could make a real difference." The meeting took place in the legal aid office where I had first learned about my rights regarding the Beaumont financial documents. The supervising attorney, a woman named Patricia Gutierrez, reviewed Evelyn's documentation with the same amazement her colleague had shown years earlier. "Ms. Rodriguez," she said, looking up from the thick file, "this is extraordinary evidence of systematic workplace abuse. The detailed accounts, the documented patterns of behavior, the financial irregularities, this could be the foundation for legislation protecting domestic workers from this kind of treatment." She explained that my story, supported by Evelyn's meticulous records, could help pass laws requiring written contracts for domestic work, establishing minimum wage standards for household employees, and creating legal remedies for workers who face discrimination or abuse. "Would you be willing to testify before the state legislature?" she asked. "Your voice, combined with this evidence, could change lives for thousands of people who work in private homes across New York." The thought of speaking publicly about my experience terrified and thrilled me simultaneously. For so many years, I had been voiceless, invisible, dismissed as unimportant. Now I was being asked to speak for others who still lived in that shadow, to use my pain as a bridge to their freedom. I agreed, and the next few months were filled with meetings, interviews, and preparation for testimony. Sarah took time off from her studies to help me organize my thoughts and practice speaking clearly about experiences I had spent years trying to forget. The day I testified before the New York State Employment Committee, I wore a simple blue dress that Sarah had helped me choose, and shoes that were comfortable enough for standing all day. The hearing room was filled with other domestic workers, advocacy groups, and legislators who had the power to change lives with their votes. When my name was called, I walked to the microphone with steady steps, carrying Evelyn's documentation and 15 years of experience. I looked out at the faces in the audience and saw my own story reflected in the eyes of women who still rose at dawn to clean other people's homes, who still swallowed insults and indignities for the sake of steady work. "My name is Margaret Rodriguez," I began, my voice clear and strong. "For 15 years, I worked as a domestic employee for a wealthy Manhattan family. I was paid below minimum wage, denied basic benefits, and subjected to treatment that would be illegal in any other workplace. I stayed because I needed the job and because I believed I had no other choice." I told them about the verbal abuse, the financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation that kept workers trapped in cycles of dependence and fear. I spoke about the invisibility, the way domestic workers become furniture in the homes we maintain, present but not seen, useful but not valued. But I also told them about dignity, how it had never actually been taken from me, only hidden under layers of fear and desperation. I explained how finding my voice had not only freed me, but had created ripple effects that were still spreading, inspiring my daughter and giving hope to workers who had seen their own experiences reflected in my story. "Domestic workers are not asking for charity," I concluded, my voice rising with conviction. "We are asking for the same basic protections and respect afforded to every other worker in this state. We are asking to be seen as human beings who deserve dignity in our labor and fairness in our compensation." The bill we supported passed by a wide margin 6 months later. The Margaret Rodriguez Domestic Workers Protection Act, they named it after me, established minimum wage requirements for private household employees, mandated written contracts, created legal remedies for workplace abuse, and provided a path to organization for workers who had previously been isolated and powerless. The signing ceremony took place in Albany on a bright October day. I stood behind the governor as she signed the legislation, surrounded by other domestic workers who had found their voices and legislators who had chosen to listen. Sarah was there, beaming with pride as she watched her mother make history. After the ceremony, a reporter asked me how it felt to have my name on legislation that would protect thousands of workers. I thought about that question for a long moment, remembering the woman who had once been afraid to ask for a single day off. "It feels like coming full circle," I said finally. 15 years ago, I believed I was powerless. Today, I understand that power was always there. I just needed to learn how to claim it. If this law prevents even one person from accepting treatment they don't deserve, then every moment of pain I experienced was worthwhile. The cafe continued to thrive, becoming not just a place for good food, but a community center where workers could meet, share resources, and support each other. I hosted Know Your Rights workshops in the evenings, helping other domestic employees understand their legal protections and how to advocate for themselves. Mrs. Chen, my first regular customer, became my unofficial business partner, managing the front of the house while I focused on cooking and community organizing. She had been a labor activist in her youth in Taiwan, she finally confided, and working with me rekindled her passion for workers' rights. "You remind me why I became involved in advocacy in the first place," she told me one evening as we locked up the cafe together. "Sometimes we forget that the most powerful stories come from people who have lived the struggles themselves." Tommy continued his monthly visits throughout high school, and I watched him grow from a confused, isolated child into a confident young man who saw his deafness as simply one aspect of his identity. He was accepted to Gallaudet University, the prestigious school for deaf students, where he planned to study education so he could teach other deaf children to find their voices as he had found his. "I want to be for other kids what you were for me," he said during one of his visits, now 18 and preparing for college. "Someone who sees their potential instead of their limitations, someone who believes in them when their families can't." His relationship with his parents remained complicated, but had improved somewhat. Richard and Charlotte were attending family therapy and learning sign language, finally acknowledging that their son's deafness was not something to hide, but something to accommodate and celebrate. The process was slow and sometimes painful, but it was progress. Sarah graduated from Columbia with highest honors and was accepted to law school with plans to specialize in workers' rights and immigration law. She had spent her college years volunteering with advocacy groups and had helped draft additional legislation based on the success of the bill that bore my name. "I want to practice the kind of law that changes lives," she told me at her graduation, her cap tilted at a proud angle and her future stretching bright before her. "I learned from watching you that the most powerful advocacy comes from understanding the human cost of injustice." As I stood in the crowd of families celebrating their graduates, I thought about all the ceremonies I had missed while working for the Beaumonts, all the milestones I had sacrificed for their convenience. This moment felt like reclaiming all of those lost celebrations at once. The years that followed brought a quiet satisfaction I had never imagined possible. The cafe provided a comfortable living while giving me a platform to continue advocacy work. I was invited to speak at conferences, consulted on policy development, and recognized as a leader in the domestic workers' rights movement. But the recognition, while gratifying, wasn't what made me happiest. What filled me with joy was the ordinary magic of daily life. Reading a book without interruption, taking walks without destination, cooking for people who appreciated both the food and the hands that prepared it. I corresponded regularly with other domestic workers who had found courage to speak up about their treatment, many of them referencing my story as their inspiration. Their letters filled a shoebox in my bedroom, testimonials to the power of one person's decision to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a young woman named Rosa who worked for a wealthy family in Connecticut. She wrote, "Reading about your experience helped me understand that I wasn't crazy to expect basic respect. I used the law you helped create to negotiate a fair contract with my employers. For the first time in 3 years, I have weekends off and health insurance. Thank you for showing me that I deserved better. On quiet Sunday mornings, I often walked through Central Park, passing the building where I had once worked in invisible servitude. The Beaumont penthouse windows gleamed in the morning sun, and I wondered sometimes about the person who now cleaned those floors, hoping they understood their worth in ways I had not. I felt no bitterness toward the family that had treated me so poorly. They had been my teachers, though I doubted they ever understood the role they played in my education. Every cruel word had eventually strengthened my resolve. Every moment of invisibility had eventually taught me to see myself more clearly. The woman I had become bore little resemblance to the frightened janitor who had once scrubbed their marble floors, but she had grown from that woman, built upon her foundations of endurance and quiet strength, transformed by pain into someone who could spare others from similar suffering. If I could speak to that younger Margaret now, cleaning windows 42 floors above Manhattan in the pre-dawn darkness, I would tell her that her worth was never determined by their inability to see it. I would tell her that dignity is not something others can grant or withhold. It is something we carry within ourselves, waiting for the courage to claim it. I would tell her that the voice she was afraid to use would eventually speak for thousands, that the pain she was enduring would become the foundation for healing, that the invisible woman she felt herself to be would one day stand in the bright lights of legislative chambers and television studios, representing hope for workers across the state. Most importantly, I would tell her that the love she poured into caring for a neglected child would return to her multiplied, that the kindness she showed despite receiving none would eventually circle back in ways she could never imagine. The book I eventually wrote about my experience became a bestseller, not because of literary merit, but because it gave voice to experiences that millions of people had lived, but few had been able to articulate. The proceeds funded a scholarship program for children of domestic workers, ensuring that another generation would have opportunities their parents had been denied. At the book's launch party, held in my cafe surrounded by the community that had embraced and sustained me, I looked around at faces that had become family. Mrs. Chen, who had shown me that friendship could exist without agenda. Sonia, who had taught me that even the strongest plants need rest to bloom. Sarah, who had learned from my journey to fight for justice. Tommy, who had found his voice, partly because I had finally found mine. The Beaumonts did not attend, and I had not expected them to. We inhabited different worlds now, they in their penthouse of inherited privilege, and I in my street-level life of earned respect. The distance between us was measured not in floors, but in understanding. They still could not comprehend what they had lost when they lost me. But that loss, I had learned, was entirely theirs. I had gained everything that mattered: self-respect, meaningful work, a voice that could change lives, and the knowledge that I had survived their worst and emerged stronger. On the 5th anniversary of opening my cafe, the city declared it an official landmark, recognizing its role as a community gathering place and a headquarters for worker advocacy. The small plaque by the door read, "Margaret's Kitchen, where dignity is always on the menu." Standing outside my cafe that morning, reading those words etched in bronze, I realized that I had finally achieved something the Beaumont millions could never buy. I had become exactly who I was meant to be, and that person was someone worth celebrating. The woman in the mirror now showed no trace of the frightened janitor who had once apologized for existing. She was proud, strong, and surrounded by people who saw her value without question. She had learned that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to accept less than you deserve, and sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks truth from experience. To anyone who recognizes themselves in my story, remember this: you are not defined by how others treat you. You are not limited by the circumstances that currently constrain you. You are not doomed to accept what has always been simply because change feels impossible. Your voice matters. Your dignity is not negotiable. Your worth is not determined by others' ability to recognize it. And sometimes, when you finally find the courage to stand up for yourself, you discover that you were never actually powerless. You were just waiting for the right moment to claim the power that was always yours. That moment is whenever you decide it is. That moment is now. Have you or someone you know ever lived through something like this? Share your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach another person who works with dedication and heart. To continue these emotional journeys, we've created a special podcast with stories just as moving. You can find it here, on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. I'll see you in the next story.